no gunshots, no blades, only death. In the summer of 1348, England watched its maps go blank. Half the kingdom's population, roughly 3 million souls, would soon lie in mass graves. Fields would be surrendered to the encroaching wilderness, and church bells would toll in vain until no one was left alive to ring them. This cataclysm did not spring from a mighty army. Instead, it slithered in on the breath of a killer no one could see and no one could stop. It all began on a still June day at Melcombe Harbor near Weymouth. Amidst the gentle lull of the waves and the pungent scent of sea salt, a merchant ship from Gascony quietly docked. On deck, fiery sailors tossed mooring ropes to the pier, unaware they were delivering a death sentence to an entire nation. In the shadows of the hold, nestled between wooden crates and bolts of fine, silk-black rats, carrying fleas infested with Yersinia pestis bacteria, slipped silently onto English soil. They brought with them a biological poison, a force capable of turning a healthy man into a blackened corpse in just 3 short days. Death began its transcontinental journey with horrifying speed, sowing destruction faster than any war in history. From the Dorset coast, the plague erupted like a forest fire sweeping through Devon and Somerset before charging north toward Bristol, one of the realm's busiest commercial gateways. Here, the true horror unmasked itself through grotesque symptoms, agonizing swollen buboes in the armpits and groin, fevers that scorched the veins, and the utter helplessness of medieval medicine. When the city of Gloucester desperately slammed its gates to bar those fleeing Bristol, they mistakenly believed stone walls could stop the Grim Reaper. But the plague required no passport. It seeped through every sack of grain and hitched a ride on every frantic breath of the refugees. By the autumn of 1348, that dark shadow reached the doorstep of London. The bustling capital, with its cramped alleys and poetic Thames, was about to become a massive death trap. 6 million Englishmen had no inkling that the stable world they trusted was disintegrating in real time. Survival no longer depended on faith or fortune. It had become a random game of fate, all starting the moment that fated ship docked at Melcombe. In London that autumn, whispers began of a bizarre phenomenon. Rats, the age-old enemies of the granaries, were suddenly dropping dead by the thousands in the sewage-stench streets. At first, citizens watched with idle curiosity, seeing it as a minor omen. But soon a haunting silence fell over the bustling markets of the Thames. Shops shuttered for no apparent reason. Rumors of an invisible force knocking on doors in the dead of night left hearts cold with dread. People wondered what could make the bravest knights tremble behind locked gates. Why did once devoted priests refuse to give last rites to the dying? The answer lay not in a coup or a magical curse, but in the total collapse of every value humanity held dear. As the veil of curiosity was torn away, London was revealed as a sprawling slaughterhouse. The plague didn't just arrive by one path. It flooded the capital from 3 directions at once, overland from Weymouth by sea along the coast, and through merchants fleeing Gloucester. London's narrow, dark, and crowded streets became the perfect nursery for death. Here people faced the 3 terrifying faces of the Reaper, the blackened swellings of the bubonic plague, the lung-shredding bloody coughs of the pneumonic strain, and the lightning-fast strike of the septicemic variety, which could turn a man laughing at dawn into a dark corpse by sunset. The cruelty of the plague struck a lethal blow to the backbone of English society, the Church. Once the spiritual anchor and the only infrastructure of life, the clergy were now the ones falling the fastest. Because their duties required close contact for anointing and burying the dead priests in York and elsewhere, died at rates nearing 50%. When parish cemeteries ran out of room, massive plague pits at Smithfield were gouged open, swallowing thousands of bodies without ritual or prayer. Ironclad faith in a divine order was violently shaken as people watched their living saints writhe in agony just like any common sinner. By the end of 1348, the Kingdom of England was no longer an organized society, but a collection of shards held together by fear. Common moral codes were swept away. Parents abandoned children. Husbands fled wives. and the wealthy retreated to distant estates, only to realize they had unwittingly carried the killer inside their own trunks. England collapsed, not for lack of weapons, but because the web of obligation and trust, the very thing that binds a society, had been completely shredded. In the darkness of that winter, people began to understand that this was not just an epidemic, it was the end of the world as they knew it. Entering 1350, as the tsunami of death began to recede, an eerie stillness blanketed the English countryside. Survivors stepped out of their homes to face an unimaginable landscape. Ghost villages with not a soul in sight, cattle wandering aimlessly through fields with no one to tend them, and crops ripening only to rot because there was no one left to harvest. People began to wonder, with half the nation underground, what value did a lord's gold coin still hold? Who would plow this land? And more importantly, who would obey when even the most powerful man trembled before a healthy peasant? A mix of curiosity and fear crept into the castles. Could the old world order survive when its only fuel, human labor, had become the rarest luxury in the kingdom? The old world of England was built on an iron rule. The lord held the power of life and death, while the peasants were cheap pawns. But the Black Death flipped the board overnight. As the labor market was wiped clean, a brutal reality dawned on the aristocracy. Vast lands were nothing but a burden, without hands to work them. Surviving peasants, having endured the nightmare and realizing their newfound value, began a quiet revolution. They didn't use swords, they used absence. In Oxfordshire, laborers began demanding wages double, triple, or even 5 times higher than before the plague. The absolute power of the lords vanished in an instant, as they were forced to plead with those they once considered dirt to return to work and save the harvest. Panic reached the palace. King Edward III, in a desperate attempt to freeze the flow of history, issued the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, forcing wages back to pre-plague levels. English courts were flooded with lawsuits. Hundreds were prosecuted for daring to ask for more than the old rate. However, man-made law was utterly powerless against the mathematics of death. Lords, though furious, were so desperate that they secretly broke the king's law, paying higher wages just to lure workers. A status shift unprecedented in history was taking place. Poor peasants could now choose their masters, inherit vast lands from deceased relatives, and for the first time in their lives, taste the flavor of freedom. The consequences of this economic war were deeper than any invasion. Serfdom, the shackles that had bound man to the soil for centuries, began to crack at the roots. The ghost communities that vanished left behind not just grief, but the space for a new social order to form. England was like a body restructuring itself. Rents plummeted, individual farm sizes soared, and a new middle class began to spark from the very laborers who survived. The shadow of the plague never truly disappeared. But within those ruins, the English began to understand they could never go back. A new kingdom was being molded by the very hands once deemed the lowliest of all. For 30 years after the first outbreak, a deceptive calm settled over the English villages. Peasants now had money in their pockets, meat on their tables, and more land than their ancestors ever dreamed of. However, in cold stone manners, the aristocracy was quietly sharpening legal blades to reclaim their lost power. Tax collectors began appearing more frequently in parishes. Harsh sentences were handed down to those demanding high wages, and a simmering resentment spread from Kent to Essex. People wondered, would those who survived the wrath of God accept bowing to the greed of men? A restless curiosity filled the halls of power. Now that the old chains were rusted by the blood of the pandemic, what would they use to bind the feet of those who had tasted liberty? The answer came in 1381, not through negotiation, but through the raging fires of the Peasants' Revolt. 3 decades of suppressed tension from wage-freeze decrees exploded into a violent storm. The rebels were no longer weak, desperate wretches. They were battle-hardened survivors, marching straight for London with a single earth-shattering demand: the total abolition of serfdom. They torched the Savoy Palace of the Duke of Lancaster, stormed the Tower of London, and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest official of the church. England realized with a shudder that the Black Death hadn't just killed people. It had forged a new breed of human ones who no longer feared crown or clergy after witnessing the helplessness of both before the plague. Though the revolt was crushed with blood and the hollow promises of the young King Richard II, the wheel of history could not be turned back. Serfdom. The chains of the soil was officially in its death throes. By 1400, free land tenure had almost entirely replaced ancient feudal obligations. But the change didn't stop at economics. A quiet revolution was happening in the very breath of the nation. Due to a severe shortage of teachers who knew French, the language of the ruling class, everyday English began to rise dominantly in schools and offices. This provided the fertile ground for writers like Geoffrey Chaucer to begin penning masterpieces in the language of the common people, laying the foundation for modern English cultural identity. As the 14th century drew to a close, England had become a completely different land. Old social structures had been swept away by plague and revolt, leaving a void for the rise of the middle class and a new sense of national pride. The devastation of Yersinia pestis had unintentionally become the midwife of a fairer, freer society. Yet amidst the glory of change, the price paid could never be forgotten. Deep psychological scars and an immune system reshaped through agony. The Kingdom of England survived, but it was no longer the kingdom of 1348. It stepped out of the shadow of the Black Death with a stronger face, but one filled with skepticism about the stability of the world. As the first rays of the 15th century shone through the stained glass windows of ancient cathedrals, a strange change was noted in the eyes of those kneeling in prayer. It was no longer blind submission or cowering before divine power, but a haunting, skeptical silence. Ghost villages were now swallowed by green forests, and the gas pits at Smithfield were covered in lush grass. But in the heart of every family, a question smoldered. Why did God let the righteous die in agony alongside the wicked? People wondered when survival is merely a lottery of fate, where lies the meaning of penance and faith. A bitter curiosity seeped into the era. Did this world truly run on a divine order? Or was it just a chain of cruel accidents that humans were forced to adapt to in order to survive? The post-pandemic reality exposed a harsh truth. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it ended a specific way of understanding the universe. Survivors stepped out of the darkness, not with relief, but with an unprecedented psychological burden. They had seen parents abandon children, priests flee the altar, and kings rendered helpless by a tiny bacterium. The collapse of trust created a profound cultural pivot. English architecture shifted from elaborate, ornate styles to the simpler, more functional perpendicular style, a testament to the shortage of skilled craftsmen and a psychological preference for clarity and decisiveness. English, the tongue of the peasants, who stubbornly outlived the plague, officially overthrew French to become the soul of the nation, clearing the path for geniuses like Chaucer to build the bedrock of great literature. The legacy of 1348 was literally etched into the blood of future generations. Modern studies show that this brutal, natural selection reshaped the English immune system for centuries. Those carrying genetic mutations resistant to the plague were the only ones left to pass their bloodline into the future. The Black Death unintentionally turned England into a massive biological laboratory, where survival didn't depend on silver or titles, but on the silent adaptation of cells. From the mass death, a stronger, more resilient race was born, ready to face the upheavals of a world where stability was now a luxury. England was finally rebuilt, but it was never again as it was before 1348. The fields were replanted, the markets reopened, and children were born into a kingdom wider and more full of opportunity than any previous generation.